No cover note, just a subject line that read, Estate of Colonel Marcus Whitaker, Inventory Summary. The probate clerk's office sent it as a PDF attachment. Draft. I almost didn't open it that morning. I had 3 unopened sympathy cards still on the kitchen counter and a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside them. It had been 11 days since the funeral. I wasn't ready for paperwork, but I opened it. The document was 4 pages. Standard formatting, case number, decedent's name, date of death. I scrolled through it the way you scroll through a terms and conditions agreement, not really reading, just moving my eyes down the page until something caught them. It was a line item, buried in the middle of page 3. Defense Technology Group, LLC, 4,200 shares, transferred, private sale, post-mortem. I read it twice. Then I picked up my phone and called the number printed at the bottom of the summary. A clerk answered on the 3rd ring. I asked her to read back the transfer date on that line item. She put me on hold for 40 seconds. When she came back, she read it without hesitation. 4 days after we'd stood in the rain at Arlington, 4 days after Karen had gripped my arm during the rifle salute and leaned in close, and said your father would be proud of how strong you're being. The estate filing hadn't even been finalized yet. I didn't say anything. The clerk waited. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, a quiet, patient sound, and I just held the phone and looked at that line on the page and did not say one word. That was the moment I understood what the next chapter of my life was going to cost me. I went back to the house the day after the funeral because someone had to. Karen had already left by then, driven back to her apartment in the city with 2 suitcases and a quiet efficiency that I'd stopped trying to interpret. She'd said something about needing space to process. I'd nodded and watched her go, and then driven 40 minutes in the opposite direction to the house where my father had lived for the last 18 years of his life. The study was the room I'd been dreading. It was exactly as he'd left it. Commendations framed in 2 rows on the left wall, arranged by year, not by rank, which was the kind of distinction that mattered to him. A locked filing cabinet in the corner that I didn't yet have a key for, and the desk wide dark wood, with a slight groove worn into the left side of the surface where he'd rested his arm for 30 years of paperwork, correspondence, and quiet thinking. I stood in the doorway for a while before I went in. I'd told myself I was going to do this slowly, that I was going to go through everything carefully the way he would have gone through it, methodically, 1 drawer at a time, nothing rushed. He'd spent his career making sure things were done in the right order. I thought I owed him the same. I sat down at his desk, opened my laptop to start a rough inventory list. That was when the email arrived. I almost closed the tab, but the subject line said Estate of Colonel Marcus Whitaker, Inventory Summary Draft, and I knew I couldn't put off. I opened it, scrolled through 4 pages of standard formatting. Case number, decedent's name, date of death. Assets listed in dry institutional language that turned a man's entire life into a column of line items. I was nearly through page 3 when I stopped. Defense Technology Group, LLC, 4,200 shares, transferred, private sale, post-mortem. I read it twice. Then I set both hands flat on the desk on the same worn surface where my father had rested his arm for 30 years, and I sat very still and did not move for a long time. I drove to Karen's apartment that evening. I didn't call ahead. She answered the door in a silk blouse and reading glasses, holding a glass of red wine, and if my arrival surprised her, nothing in her face showed it. She stepped back and let me in without being asked, which told me she'd been expecting this conversation, if not necessarily tonight. Her apartment was immaculate, everything in its place. I sat on the edge of an armchair I hadn't been invited to sit in and told her what I'd seen in the inventory summary. She listened with the patient, slightly tilted attention of someone who has already prepared their answer. When I finished, she set down the wine. She explained it calmly. As surviving spouse, she had authority over marital assets during the probate window. The shares were jointly held, or close enough, she said, her tone giving the phrase just enough room to sound reasonable. A financial advisor had arranged the transaction. She had documentation. It had all been handled properly. She offered me coffee. I asked her why she hadn't told me. She said she hadn't wanted to burden me with financial matters while I was still grieving. She said it with genuine warmth, the kind she was very good at producing on short notice, and I sat there and watched her face and thought about the transfer date on that document. 4 days after Arlington, for days after she'd stood in the rain beside me and told me my father would be proud. I left without the coffee. I stood in her driveway for a moment in the cold, jaw set, running through every angle I had. She'd been composed because she could afford to be. She had documentation. She was standing. I had a line item on a draft summary and a date that felt wrong and no legal ground to stand on. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and nothing to show for the conversation except the certainty that I was already behind. Reeves called again at 5:52 a.m. I hadn't slept. I was still at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the folder for my father's lockbox open in front of me. I had read the handwritten note, probably 12 times. The metal is the key. If it's missing, the chip is already moving. We have it, Reeves said. I closed my eyes for 1 second. The cargo had been flagged at the shipping hub's pre-departure screening station. Federal Customs agents had pulled the package, listed on the flight manifest as a collection of antique decorative pieces bound for an address in Eastern Europe. The physical inspection had found 17 items packed in foam and sawdust. My father's metal had been wrapped separately inside a brass ornamental box that had probably been chosen because it looked like just another antique among the rest. But that was not the most significant part of what Reeves told me next. When the customs agent examined the metal with a detection wand on routine protocol, it triggered a secondary alert. Not for the tracking signal, for something else. Something embedded in the clasp itself that the scanner had picked up as a dense, layered anomaly. The metal had weight that wasn't just metal. There's something inside the casing, Reeves said. We're opening it now. The call came back 40 minutes later. Reeves's voice had changed. Not alarmed. Be more careful. The way people speak when they have just confirmed something significant and are still deciding how much to say at once. Inside the clasp of my father's metal, sealed within a microcavity in the base metal, was a data chip, the size of a thumbnail, encased in a resin compound that had been designed to prevent detection by standard scanners. It had been there for 9 years. My father had known it was there the entire time. He had carried it through his final years of service, through his retirement, through his illness, with that chip sealed inside a piece of metal hanging on his study wall. And he had told me to protect it, not because he thought I would understand what it was, because he knew that when the time came, I would do what he asked without hesitation. Reeves said the chip contained operational documents from the covert maritime mission. Coordinates, communications logs, and identity files of individuals connected to the weapons technology transfer network. Information preserved specifically because there had been serious concern at the time that official channels might be compromised. My father hadn't just participated in that mission. He had been protecting its record ever since the day it ended. That was why they had come for the metal. That was why he told me to guard it. Reeves came to the house one final time 3 days later. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table where all of this had started and explained what his division had been able to confirm once the chip's contents were fully analyzed. He spoke with more openness than before. Not everything, there were things he said were still classified and would remain so, but enough. My father's mission had disrupted a planned transfer of guidance system technology to a network that had been attempting to develop it for offensive use. The operation had been conducted without official acknowledgement to protect the operatives involved and the intelligence methods that had been used. For 9 years, that complete record had existed only on a chip inside a metal on a wall. If that chip had left the country, Reeves said, the individuals named in those files would have been in danger, and the network would have known precisely which intelligence methods to avoid going forward. My father had understood all of this. He had carried that weight through retirement and illness and death. He had pressed a lockbox into my hands in a hospital room and trusted me with a responsibility he couldn't explain in full. He had given me the key to a box that held instructions for a situation he hoped would never come. He had trusted me to hold the line if it did. I asked quietly when I could have the medal back. Reeves said soon. Wade's case moved through federal processing over the following weeks. I wasn't involved in the legal proceedings. Reeves kept me updated in broad terms. The charges were not minor: unauthorized transfer of restricted military property, knowing communication with a federally monitored trafficking network. His cooperation with investigators would factor into the outcome, but the cooperation itself had limits. He had sent those photographs. He had made those calls. Those things were on record and would not disappear. He was not going to prison. Reeves said that plainly when I asked. The federal system in cases like this was more interested in dismantling the network than in punishing the edge-level participants who had been used as entry points. But the consequences were real. A federal charge on his record. Substantial fines. A legal process that would follow him for years. I didn't feel satisfied when I heard that. I felt something quieter. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But an absence of the burning that had been sitting in my chest since the night the fork hit the plate. Donna called me once during that period. She said she knew things had gotten out of hand. She said she wished it had gone differently. She didn't say she was wrong. She didn't say Wade was wrong. But she had stopped saying everyone else was to blame. That was the most honest she had been in 3 years. I told her I appreciated the call and hung up. The ceremony was small. A conference room in a federal building downtown. Reeves was there and Pruitt and 2 officials I hadn't met before. One of them was in full dress uniform. He introduced himself as Captain Doyle. He had served in the same naval command as my father 20 years ago, long before the covert mission, before any of this. He held the medal in both hands when he presented it to me. Chief Mercer was one of the most methodical operators I have known in 30 years of service, he said. He did not do things without purpose. The fact that that chip survived 9 years intact because he placed it in the right hands tells you everything about his judgment. I took the medal. It was lighter than I expected. Or maybe I had been carrying its weight so long that it had become ordinary. Captain Doyle looked at me and said, "Your father trusted you for a reason." I didn't say anything right away. I looked at the medal in my hands, the dark ribbon, the silver clasp, the faint micro-engravings I could barely see, and I thought about my father sitting on the edge of my bed when I was 10 years old, telling me quietly to protect it. No drama. No explanation I could fully understand. Just a man who knew what was coming and chose the one person he believed would still be standing when it arrived. He had been right. And this time, no one will ever take that from me again. She found out the next morning. I don't know who told her, whether someone in the probate clerk's office mentioned the filing inquiry, or whether her attorney saw Brooks's name on an incoming document and made a call. But by mid-morning, Brooks's paralegal flagged something in the account activity. Karen had initiated a transfer of the sale proceeds to a secondary account registered in her daughter's name from a prior marriage. The timestamp was clear. The transfer happened after Brooks had filed and before the freeze order was served. Brooks reviewed the record at his desk. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she just made this significantly easier. I asked him to explain. What Karen had done, he said, had a specific legal name: dissipation, the deliberate movement of estate assets to avoid court authority. It transformed a civil dispute over a procedural clause into something with substantially more weight. She'd been trying to protect herself. Instead, she'd handed him the clearest piece of evidence in the file, time-stamped and traceable, moving money in the 90-minute window between the filing and the freeze. I thought about my father for a moment. His patience, his habit of waiting for the other side to make the mistake rather than pressing too early. He would have called it a gift. I sat in the chair across from Brooks and let that settle, and outside the window the afternoon light was going flat and gray, and there were now less than 20 hours left. I went back to the house that night. I don't know exactly why. I had nothing to do there. Brooks had the filing, the evidence was in order, and there was nothing left that required my presence before morning. But I drove out anyway, let myself in, and walked back to the study. Everything was exactly as I'd left it 2 days ago. Commendations on the wall, the locked filing cabinet, the desk with the worn groove in the left surface. I sat down in the chair. I wasn't thinking about the injunction. I wasn't thinking about Fitch or Karen or the transfer record or the freeze order. I was thinking about my father in this room 6 months ago, sitting at this same desk, in this same chair, going through the will with an attorney and adding a clause with my name in it. Not calling me, not mentioning it, just making sure it was there, witnessed, binding, tucked into page 9 of a document I hadn't known to look for. He hadn't needed me, no. He just needed it to be done. I sat there for a long time in the quiet of that room, with the commendations on the wall and the groove in the desk surface and 31 years of careful, unhurried preparation in every corner of it. And I thought about what it means to be protected by someone who didn't make a production of protecting you. The light outside was fully dark by the time I got up. I drove back into the city and went to sleep and set my alarm for 6. Brooks called at 6:18 a.m. The emergency injunction had been granted. The transfer was frozen. Fitch had already confirmed the unwind through his attorney. The transaction was being reversed, the shares returned to the estate. Per the will's distribution terms, with the right of first refusal clause intact and exercised, they went to me. I drove to the barracks office. Brooks was at his desk when I arrived, in uniform, nothing out of place. He slid the reversal order across the desk without ceremony or announcement, the way a man slides a piece of paper when the paper is the whole point. I looked at it for a long time. Neither of us said much. There wasn't a great deal that needed to be said. My father had built something over 3 decades. Carefully, without announcing it, adding a clause to protect it 6 months before he died and telling no one except a witness and a quiet attorney in a converted barracks building 20 minutes from a base. He hadn't made it dramatic. He just made it thorough. He knew. He just made sure the law knew too. I folded the order once along a clean crease, put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, and stood up. Brooks stood when I did, and we shook hands once, the same as when I'd arrived. I thanked him. He nodded, which was enough. I walked out into the morning. The air was cold and the light was early and pale, and I stood by my car for a moment before I got in. Somewhere across the city, the paperwork was already processing. Somewhere, Karen would be getting a call from her attorney. Fitch was already gone. And somewhere on page 9 of a will updated 6 months ago, my father's handwriting, or close enough to it, had done exactly what he'd intended. I got in the car and drove home.